The things that influence you growing up are not necessarily the things you did the most reading about. Um, in high school, it's not that I read a whole lot of books about the French Revolution. I was just burdened with the awareness that this was really one of the most important events in the history of the world, and that pretty much every other important event after it in the history of the world is linked to it in a dynamic way. So, I mean, I can remember being in history classroom with other kids the same age I was in high school, and we'd all read the same book about the French Revolution, but I had learned more than they had. I knew far more than they had because I really agonized over that book. I was really paying attention. And I just want to mention today, a student in that situation, it might be that they learn more because they're also reading articles in Wikipedia. Like you're reading the same textbook or the same assigned readings as everyone else. But when there's something you don't understand, you're taking the time to look something up on Wikipedia or to Google it. Well, it's still today. I'm in my 40s. Still do that now. We talk about that when reading a book takes a lot longer because you're doing the reading outside the book. But back in those days, back when I was a teenager, there was nothing like that at all. It was really just me sitting there and agonizing over the book. And I didn't have an encyclopedia. I didn't have a dictionary. It was really just thinking and worrying about the book. And in this way, I worried my way into wisdom at an earlier age than some of my more carefree friends and colleagues. Now, in the same way, I've got to say, during high school, it's not that I did a huge amount of reading about theater, about the creative arts, about being a painter, quite apart from being an author and so on. But what I read, I really took seriously. I really worried about. I never imagined I'd be living in the world that YouTube has created, nor the world that YouTube has destroyed. I didn't think I would be earning my living or expressing myself or trying to influence the world politically with my face and my voice in this way. None of this did I imagine. Um, what I had in mind for myself was that I was going to struggle to walk the same ancient narrow path that all these other authors and creative people had walked for centuries before me. And that's a path primarily dominated by the written word, by what you can publish. But then secondarily, there was this strange and important role for working with others. Look at the life of a guy like Bertolt Brecht. Can you get together 5, 10 people who want to perform the play you've written, want to perform the script you've written, the life of the mind and getting noticed and mattering, making your words matter as an author meant working together with groups of people that way. I'm not telling you that during high school I read a huge stack of books on this. I didn't. But every word I read, I really agonized over. And I saw how it applied to me, and I saw how it applied to my situation. And just in the autobiographies of these authors I was reading, sometimes also like the short biography at the front of a book or at the end of the book written by another author for really famous and accomplished authors. That's often the case, whether as an introduction or an event. Someone else has written a short biography that's included with the book, telling you, in almost all cases, the brilliance and accomplishments of these people were already demonstrated while they were in high school. So I'm reading about these people, and it's like, yeah, they started their own small magazine while they were in high school. And I was looking around and talking to my friends about doing this. Whether it was that they started their own magazine, started their own small newspaper, started publishing collections of poetry, or started writing and performing plays. I can't remember an example of someone doing stand-up comedy or one-man shows. I mean, that's been the fashion since really the 1980s in the Western world. And that's obviously an easier thing you can do while you're still in high school. But I'm looking at these examples of brilliant and highly accomplished people, what they had already done in high school. A lot of them never went to university, right? But of those who went to university, what they were already publishing and accomplishing while they're in university. And I realized there's a social dimension of this. Like I realized I've got to cooperate with other people. I can't just publish and write the entire magazine from cover to cover myself. And I'm looking around at my colleagues and contemporaries, and I'm like, okay, why does nobody else have the same kind of ambition I have? Many years later, I had a girlfriend, and she's referred to consistently on this channel as my blonde ex-girlfriend. Probably those of you who are real fans of the channel have already Googled around and figured out who this is, but it doesn't matter. She was an aspiring painter at the time, and as far as I know, she's still an aspiring painter now, which is to say she's accomplished nothing. But, I had many conversations with her about art and painting, the life of an artist and the career of an artist and what goes into it, that made me aware of how much I knew about that compared to the average person who'd never taken an interest in it, while I'd never considered that career path for myself. Now, if you know who my parents are, it's kind of obvious. I grew up around that stuff. I grew up meeting and speaking to accomplished artists, painters, sculptors, and so on. And both of my parents were gallerists in 21st century parlance. They were involved with being the curators of museums and art galleries their whole lives. And the term they preferred to use themselves was being the planners of museums. But they were involved in the museum and art gallery world really their whole lives. Again, actually, I didn't even think of this. But, my mother is an example of someone who was already writing newspaper articles in high school, right? So, sorry. I genuinely didn't think of that until this moment. I don't think of my mother as a model for emulation that way. But sure, she also would have been someone who was already making it happen and making a name for herself in high school and then in her university years. And you know how that turned out. Anyway, when I had this girlfriend, and she was kind of getting herself psyched up and looking at what her options were as a painter and thinking of that as her career, while at the same time, obviously, she was realistically thinking to herself she'd have other part-time jobs, quite possibly for her whole life. There was no reason to think she'd be able to pay her rent, out of the proceeds of her painting, or at least not within the first 10 years of beginning in that career. So you can imagine we had a lot of discussions with her. And one of the things I said to her that seemed to me so obvious, it seemed to me something everybody knew, and that she was really shocked by. And I think I said this to her one day when we were at an art gallery. And I said, "Oh, yeah, this guy, whoever it was, and well, yeah, he could have been a great artist, but, he got trapped with the success of his own technique. Like he struck on a technique that was successful, and then he kept doing it again and again. And before you know it, you're not a great artist anymore. What you're producing are knockoffs of your own earlier work, And I said a line, I was about to explain to you, I didn't invent this line. I thought everyone heard it. I said to her, a technique is a trap. Every technique is a trap. Now, it's a somewhat longer story as to the first time I heard that catchphrase, which I'm not going to tell because it's boring, but it's something I actually first heard in a documentary where they were interviewing a particular modern American abstract expressionist painter. I just used Google to see if I could find the documentary. And no, not only is there no trace of the documentary, there's no trace of anyone using this catchphrase. So getting zero Google search results, if you put in quotation marks today in English, a technique is a trap, or every technique is a trap. Anyway, for me, the most memorable thing about this conversation with my blonde ex-girlfriend was just that she was so astonished by it. Like she had never thought in these terms before. Like, guess what? If you're Shakespeare, even if you are literally Shakespeare, if you are William Shakespeare himself, and you produce a play that's a smash hit. So, to my knowledge, the Scottish play, for example, was a great success in Shakespeare's own time during his life. It's actually quite a lot of research goes into figuring out which of his plays were more successful or less successful while he was alive, as opposed to the centuries thereafter. People liked witchcraft at the time. It sold a lot of tickets. Okay, so do you go on to write another play that is basically a knockoff of what made you successful the time before? Do you allow yourself to be trapped by your own technique, right? Even for someone like Shakespeare. Now, I don't know who's going to see this video. Presumably, most of the people who click on this video know me from one of my YouTube channels or another. They know me from one of my many walks of life. I still get email to this day from people who know me as a scholar of Buddhism, which is very touching. They know work I did in Buddhism. There are some people who know me and write to me because they know me from research I did on Myanmar, Cambodia. Very rarely I get email from people interested in my work on Cree and Ojibwe, First Nations languages involved. But it's possible you're watching this video, you know me from my more recent iconoclastic work in comedy. And comedy has always been an aspect of what I did. I think you can probably look for the laughs even in the most dry humanitarian research I did, the most dry historical research and political essays. There are a few eyebrow-raising jokes here and there. But anyway, even in the most serious periods of this YouTube channel, of Abel Ciel, my main YouTube channel, there are moments of satire and self-parody and mockery and what have you, throughout it. Nobody has really dared to ask this question. But I do know there are some longtime fans of the channel who would like to ask, why not just keep on doing 2-hour monologues about Aristotle? And of course, we could say instead of just Aristotle, a category of similarly serious, dense, philosophically significant political nonfiction. Just at this moment, Melissa and I both are reading Aristotle again. So that particular example comes to mind. But I know there are people in the audience where quite literally they subscribed because they liked videos I did years ago about Aristotle, and they want more. Where that specifically is what they're looking for. And they'll put up with some joking along the way, but they didn't subscribe to follow a comedy channel. Well, what happens when you get trapped in a technique? No matter how successful, no matter how good you are at it, no matter the size of the audience that appreciates it. And so I'm now going to make a digression that's kind of more important than the main point itself. This happens with people who have no audience at all. It happens with people who have no success at all. And, Melissa and I kind of reflect on this and philosophize about this a great deal. But there are ways in which we're both really freaked out and really disturbed by what we've seen in the world of live stand-up comedy over the last couple of months. It is really disturbing to see again and again people who are trapped in a technique that they haven't mastered, that they haven't been successful with in any sense. They haven't made money. They haven't say found an audience of a few thousand people on YouTube. In a sense, they're failing again and again and again. And when we see them perform live, they're either getting no laughter at all or just sort of a little bit of laughter, which on the one hand comes from inertia, because everyone shows up at these events to have a good time. Really, the audience shows up wanting to laugh. Live comedy the audience is much more forgiving than something like a movie in a movie theater. You really can't have an audience that shows up at a movie theater with their arms crossed, expecting to live up to certain expectations. These people show up ready to laugh. They show up drunk and they get drunker for the most part. People really are there to have a good time. They're not there to judge you. They're not there to analyze how well written your act is. And then so you get a little bit of inertial laughter. And then on the other hand, there are people who really are trying to encourage you no matter how awful you are. And that includes other comedians who are in the audience. And it varied. But even the events we were at that were had the most packed crowd, I would say more than 10% of the people in the audience were comedians themselves. So even if you had, I don't know how many, did we go to anything that had 100 members of the audience? But let's say there were 60 members of the audience. There were more than 6 people in the crowd who were comedians, either performing that night or they're not performing that night, but they're there to hang on. So I think everywhere we went, at least 10% of the crowd, at least 10% of the people in seats, they are themselves comedians. And a lot of them feel like it's their professional obligation to be kind and encouraging. Okay, so my point is this. democracy in Athens was a byproduct of the theater. I have written some book chapters about this, never a whole book. If you were going to ask, why did democracy work so well in Athens? And why is it so hard to get it to work in the Muslim world today? Basically, anywhere you can name in the Muslim world. And why didn't it originate and flourish centuries ago in the Muslim world? Or why didn't any of these countries in the Muslim world simply appropriate, the best elements of democracy and then, interpret and adapt them and make them work in the Muslim world? Why is it that the transmission of democracy across cultural contexts is so difficult and so often unsuccessful? Now, during my lifetime, academia reorganized itself from first world studies versus third world studies. This was rephrased to be the global north and the global south. Terminology I find completely hilarious. Because I hate to tell you this, but Australia is further south than Cambodia. So, but for whatever reason, it's become polite left-wing parlance to talk about the global north versus the global south, with basically the global south meaning countries that remain mired in poverty, no matter how far north they are or how far south they are. Okay. I recently did a lot of research on basically the history of the United States of America, the culture of the United States of America, and especially around the time of the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution. So the century leading up to that, you could say, and a few decades after those events. Now, why was it that democracy and republicanism, which we really can't think of as two separate things, but in the United States of America, first republicanism and later democracy managed to flourish? Not in France. Right? The timelines overlap tremendously, right? Over a longer timeline, say, well, eventually the French got around to making democracy work. Yeah, eventually. It's true. How about South America? How about Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, so on and so forth? Now, again, these are not countries that have zero democracy. This is not as stark a contrast as when you're looking at Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth, right? I think anyone who really has looked at the history would sooner or later, in whatever polite language, say, you know what? The history of British Protestantism, the British Anglican Church, including rebellions against the Anglican Church, most notably the English Civil War, the rise and fall of Oliver Cromwell, a bunch of really arbitrary historical and political circumstances that are profoundly tied to religion. It produced a culture just at that time in the United States of America. This is the United States of America breaking away from the legacy of Puritanism, which was itself breaking away from the legacy of the Catholic Church, the dissenting churches within England rebelling against the Anglican Church. It's kind of very multipolar, multivalent period in English-speaking Christianity. The very, chaos and barbarism of Christianity as exists in the British Empire just at that time. It really was compatible with democracy in a way that Catholicism was not. In France, in Spain, in Italy, and in the colonies, of Catholic powers like Spain, that would subsequently become Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Cuba. It's a great example. So, this is a very, very subtle cultural distinction, right? The Anglican Church versus the Catholic. And yet, again, if you're serious about the history of democracy, serious about the history of republicanism, it's tremendous. Well, when you really look back seriously at what made democracy work in Athens and almost nowhere else. You know, I've, shout out to Crete. You know, shout out to Boeotia. Like there were a few other Greek city-states around. Don't get me wrong. And to what extent with, but why do you think ancient Egypt, right next door, in constant cultural contact with Greece, why do you think the Egyptians could never really, adopt and adapt what was useful about republicanism and democracy in Egypt? Right? Carthage, same question. I'm just saying they were surrounded by these other civilizations that were in constant contact with them, and that really never managed to pull it off. Well, the element I want to point to is theater. When the Greeks went to see theater, they sat in judgment. Theater for them was a competitive sport. Comedy for them was a competitive sport. And the audience would vote to decide the winners and the losers. If you look at the configuration and the process of an audience sitting in these seats and listening to, let's just say comedy to make it short, it's the same with tragedy, but comedy, tragedy, etc. Sitting there and listening to the comedians perform and then voting at the end of the show. Compare that to the way they organized and conducted a court trial. It's identical. You would have various actors stand up and give prepared speeches that were very dramatic. Many of them, frankly, more than 100, many dozens at least of those speeches we still have. I think safely over 100 from ancient Greece, where you can read exactly what they performed. They'd stand there and give these very dramatic and moving lectures. They would have witness testimony, but for the most part, it was the role of the orator as an actor to stand there and give this performance and to try to move the audience. And in addition to, the lectures where we have verbatim what they performed in a court of law, right? And by the way, part of the reason why these survive is not just they were written down, they were memorized and recited. The same way the Greeks memorized and recited songs, they memorized and recited hit Broadway musicals, hit shows, whether they were comedy or tragedy. They memorized a lot of poetry, both serious tragic poetry and comedic poetry. And people memorized and recited great speeches that have been given in court trials also in order to improve their own powers of oration, their own ability to participate in democracy itself, in order to become well-spoken, to be able to stand up at City Hall, stand up at the Pnyx, right, and give their own speeches and debate the fate of the nation, so to speak, in order to participate in democracy. That motivated them to do this. Let me say this is one of the reasons why these speeches survived history, was that they weren't just performed once. They were studied and recited, so on and so forth. Look at the way a trial goes, whether it's a trial for a crime like murder or it's two people suing each other, to settle a financial dispute. It is identical to the theater. When people were going to the theater, they were rehearsing the same culture and procedure of democracy that they were exercising when they were at court, being in the audience and sitting in judgment over the speeches given at a trial. And it does not take much of a leap to see the extent to which what they were doing in the formal direct democracy itself. At the Pnyx, it's not a parliament. It's really kind of insulting to Greek democracy to call it a parliament. But likewise, when they sat in judgment at the Pnyx, when they were sitting and hearing the performances and voting on it, right? This is very much the same culture. So now, nobody planned this, all right? The advantages the Greeks had, and I think it's fair to say the Romans had about 50% of this. Like, you can see the Romans kind of sort of make democracy work to some extent, but never really works the way it does for the Greeks. Whether it's 60-40 or 50-50, I'm not using a precise number. The Romans are part of the way there, but they never really get all the way there. They never managed to quite make work what did work seemingly effortlessly in Athens and other Greek city-states. But still, credit where it's due. In the Roman Republic period, The Romans get some things right, and then, as you know, as history goes on, it gets worse and worse. Um, Nobody intentionally contrived the culture of the Greek theater, the culture of the Greek comedy, or the culture of Greek Olympic sports, which is very much the same sort of thing, in order to foster a culture of direct democracy. Nobody planned it that way. Well, guess what? All the people who fought and died in the English Civil War, the people who fought and died to make Oliver Cromwell the dictator and to literally kill the king, none of them could have foreseen, the culture they were creating that really would likewise foster American democracy, American republicanism. And, yes, I am not, sorry, in case you misinterpret what I've just said as if I'm suggesting that, the conflict between Puritanism, Anglicanism, and Papism in England and the circumstances of the English Civil War. In case you think that's equivalent to what happened in Athens with no, they're not equivalent at all. They're totally different. And that's why American democracy is so profoundly different and alien from what they had in Athens. This is a contrast. It's not a parallelism. I'm not asserting these two things are alike. Well, the point is, in any of these circumstances, what is the prerequisite cultural development to take the next step towards democracy, even if it is only a partial democracy or a form of republicanism that has democratic elements? What do you need to take that step, right? Athens had it. Ancient Egypt did not. Persia did not, right? So on and so forth. And you can go forward many centuries. I'm sorry, the Ottoman Empire still exists during the French Revolution, right? Do you think anyone in the Ottoman Empire included Egypt at that time, do you think anyone in Egypt was prepared to, again, adapt and adopt the elements of republicanism and democracy? Hilariously, there's an account from an Egyptian perspective written when Napoleon goes to Egypt. And Napoleon is dead-face serious, preaching the virtues of republicanism through a translator. He's preaching republicanism to these Egyptian people. And we have recorded in writing the perspective of an Egyptian scholar who was there. And like most of these guys, of course, he's deeply steeped in Islamic scholarship, but he doesn't only know Islamic scholarship. And he's written down, again, I don't know if there's notes taken at the moment or he went back to his desk and said, republic. He means something like Plato's Republic. Because they knew those ancient Greek texts. Quite possibly they knew them in Arabic translation or with Arabic commentary. But he was familiar with Plato's Republic. So, okay, so this man has come from France to try to conquer Egypt, and he's promising us that if he liberates us from the Ottoman Empire and the Mamluks, then, we'll have something like the Republic in Plato's Republic. Okay. So my point is, these are many, many centuries apart. Well, back when Aristotle was walking the streets of Athens, there was something culturally correct, the preconditions for democracy in Athens. And it was absent in Egypt. Okay, go forward innumerable centuries. When Napoleon was walking the streets of Cairo, Egypt, there was something right, in the United States of America that was absent in Egypt. And again, France was maybe halfway there, right? France, they tried to have a democracy. They tried to have a republic for a time, and it fell apart, so on and so forth. Napoleon himself would be the death of democracy in France, in short. But still, the memory of what the French Revolution accomplished so briefly would haunt Europe for the century to come. And eventually, Europe would strive to catch up with the United States of America in this respect. Happy ending. #spoilers. Okay. If I lived in Egypt right now, and you asked me, why do you want to do comedy? This would be my answer. I want to create the cultural prerequisites so that we can have democracy. That's my answer. If I lived in France today, I can say pretty much the same thing, right? If I lived in the United States, if I lived in Canada, right? I think you guys know I do not regard Canada as a democracy today. My book is dripping with scorn for the political system we have in Canada. But of course, obviously, the situation in Canada is many steps better than the situation today in Egypt, and the situation in Egypt is many steps better than the situation in Saudi Arabia. And it's a very, very hard question. But I mean, guys, I don't know. Some of you know China, some of you don't. What would I do if I were living in China, communist China? I'm just being honest. I think it's impossible. I mean, comedy they are not comfortable with. It would not be possible for me to do political comedy. It would not be possible for me in China to engage in the kind of project I'm talking about. Taking France as an example, you know, someone who just met me might say, well, what do you mean you want to create the culture of democracy or a culture for democracy? We already have democracy. Obviously, a lot of French people would respond that way. But people who would know me personally, whether they know me through YouTube or through my books or what have you, they wouldn't need to answer, oh, okay, yeah, you have a deeper idea of democracy and higher standards for democracy, and there's something else you're aiming at. But I think, as you guys know, frankly, secularism and atheism, and if you like the progress of science, a more loaded phrase, this is still in the 21st century. This is inextricable from democracy. You can just ask, if you have a referendum today on male circumcision, do you know any country in the world where a referendum, straight plebiscite, 100% of the population votes, no conditions, where would more than 50% of people agree circumcision should be illegal? We should stop. Performed on babies, at least it should be illegal. If adults over 18 voluntarily want to do it, like as a cosmetic surgery, it's a separate question. But performing circumcision on babies. So this is an unbelievably simple question, right? So who will vote to continue the barbarity of the Dark Ages forever, and who will stand up to oppose it? Well, so right away, we just have a very easy, palpable example of how democracy becomes meaningless if you're living in a culture where the majority of people are beholden to graven idols, shall we say. They believe in ghosts, they believe in yetis, or what have you. And indeed, that is probably the single most important reason why in every era there is a tension between democracy and republicanism. Within a republic, you can have a vote on an issue, and you can only let people who are medical doctors vote. So medical doctors have a certain level of education, a certain level of experience, a certain level of erudition within a very narrow field. Do you know any country anywhere in the world today where more than 50% of medical doctors would vote to abolish circumcision? I'm sorry, but on any of these issues, any of the issues that seem so obvious to me, and frankly to my small but extremely cynical audience, if you look into it, you may be appalled at just how ignorant and selfish and stupid and short-sighted and evil medical doctors are in your culture, in my culture, around the world. It's not like you can easily point to some kind of more highly educated class where if you restrict voting on certain issues, like, for example, if you restrict voting on medical issues to people with medical university degrees, that you're going to get more positive outcomes. You might get much worse outcomes. What percentage of medical doctors believe Prozac is bad for you? And Prozac should be banned, or Prozac should be strictly limited, and who can get it? Yeah, anybody, like, why don't you compare the way doctors vote to the way the general population votes on these issues, Okay, so, it seems like we're pretty far from democracy, and the prerequisites needed to really have a democracy. And, once you get into questions of war and peace, questions where there are really huge consequences immediately for the decision that people are making. It's terrifying. It's terrifying to think of the population we have today and the culture we have today having more democracy, but it shouldn't be. Who's going to change it? How is it going to change? Right? Again, I'm not going to digress into a lengthy monologue about this. I think all of my books are kind of constantly hinting at this without necessarily giving you a direct answer. There is more than one way for it to change. But I'm telling you, being in the circumstances I'm in now, I'm engaging in cultural production in the pursuit of that change. Okay, so I return to the major theme and premise of this video. We've just seen a tremendous number of stand-up comedians. Some we only saw on stage, some we spoke to off stage, some we met with separately off stage. We went to a cocktail party, went to a coffee shop, or had some further discussion. And some, as you can imagine, I met them, spoke to them briefly, and then conversed by email, Instagram message, Facebook message, this kind of electronic communication afterward. And as I say, there's a lot, for us to reflect on, looking back and looking forward. If you knew someone who had composed just one hit song, and this one hit song had made them $1 million, you might sympathize. You might sympathize the fact that ever after they kept on trying to record the same song again and again and again. It's like, well, you had this one hit song. It made you rich. It made you somewhat famous. And then the rest of your career, as I say, a technique is a trap. You were trapped by the success of your own technique. Your new work, instead of being innovative, became derivative of your own precedent, of your own old work, right? You might also know someone who spends their whole life creating new work that's derivative of the Beatles. They never had a hit song, but they know the Beatles had hit songs, and they try again and again to make new music that is directly derived from, imitative of the Beatles. And in either case, you might know this musician, and they're running their hands through their hair, they're agonizing, and saying to you, they don't understand it. They don't understand why they can't have another hit song like their own old hit song. Or there's someone who never had a hit song, and they say, I don't understand. I'm making this song today that's just as good as this song the Beatles made in 1972. Why can't my song be a hit and reach an audience and matter and so on, the same way this song from 1972 did, right? What we've seen going on in stand-up comedy, what's scary about it, it's not just that I haven't met anyone who's trying to change the world. I haven't met anyone trying to change the world. I haven't met anyone with any political interest, neither like a political interest within comedy, nor some with a political interest outside of comedy that they're letting inform and nuance what they're doing. Okay, that's true. That's a very simple kind of disappointment. I'm just not meeting people who are smart enough or politically engaged enough to really improve. That's true. Separate issue, but no, that's true. What's so disturbing to me is that I'm seeing people who have let themselves become trapped in a technique they haven't mastered, right? They're not good at it. They're not great at it. They haven't had any success from. And a technique that on the one hand is utterly derivative of other people's work that's come before. Like it is hackneyed in the truest sense. What they're doing is derivative of what 100 other stand-up comedians have done before, what they've seen on HBO, what they've seen on Netflix, what they've seen other people doing. But this is why they can sustain it for 10 years or keep doing it for a lifetime. But at the same time, it utterly revolves around their own autobiography, the assertion of their own identity, and a peculiar kind of self-indulgence. So, a huge percentage of the material we've seen begins with I am statements. We saw one woman, it's just a very memorable example, and she began by explaining her medical diagnosis. She had a genetic disorder, and this genetic disorder is linked to certain kinds of mental problems. And then she has a therapist that she talks to about her mental problems that are rooted in this genetic disorder. And what I think the story was that her father had the same genetic disorder before her, right? It's like, And the particular club we were in, it was the most supportive audience. It like again, more than 50% of the crowd were other stand-up comedians. This is the most supportive, the most loving audience. If you just show up and try, everyone there is going to say good for you and be positive and encouraging. But she picked up on the fact that the audience was really hostile because her whole act, it was all self-indulgent, it was all autobiography, it's all assertion of who you are. We saw at least 3 disabled comedians, including that one. 2 of the comedians we saw were severely disabled and in a wheelchair, but their disability was much greater than just being in a wheelchair. I'll leave it up to your imagination. And so all 3 of the disabled comedians we saw, their entire act was about their disability, and they were expecting, and I think they're also getting, a lot of like positive reinforcement and approval. So like what they're doing, again, on the one hand, it's self-indulgent, on the other hand, it's utterly derivative of other people's work. It's like you're a musician and you're imitating the Beatles, And again, the Beatles can never be meaningful in 2023 the way they were in 1963. And guess what, motherfucker? Comedy from 2019 cannot be meaningful in 2023. Like the cycle for obsolescence is way tighter. It's way faster. It's way harsher. I feel like it's 6 months. I can't tell jokes about George W. Bush. Are you fucking kidding me? No, I think comedy by definition, whether it's 6 months or 2 years, like if something's really great in comedy, it lasts for 2 years. But I mean, this stuff gets old fast, which I love. I think that's great. I think it's wonderful to be in an art form where there's this challenge to be making up jokes about what Donald Trump said this week, not what Donald Trump said 4 years ago, what's happening now. I think that's wonderful. I think it's part of the vibrance of it. But we haven't seen a single stand-up comedian who's interested in that at all. Instead, they're stuck in this loop. A technique is a trap, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so, with these disabled comedians, and I'm saying this because I really feel the same problem is there with the able-bodied comedians. It's just less obvious. One of the things I said to Melissa after one of the stand-up comedians was, you know what? I would have respected her so much if she had done that whole set and never even mentioned that she was in a wheelchair. Like, can you just imagine if this stand-up comedian, instead of telling the same jokes about being in a wheelchair again and again for like 10 years, because they do. People use the same material for years. What if she got up and she was telling jokes about things that happened this week, this month? What if she's getting up and telling jokes about Xi Jinping and Joe Biden and whatever? Sorry, it could be It could be about Britney Spears, but it's something that happened with Britney Spears this month, not 10 years. Like, I know not everyone's going to do jokes about Xi Jinping or Donald Trump, but still, where you're doing something fresh and original, something that's meaningful now. Because again, the Beatles, what they did in 1963, can't be meaningful to this, or can't be important. If you do today what the Beatles did in 1963, it's a niche product for a niche audience for a tiny number of people. It's not going to be meaningful for a mass of people. I probably could I could make my whole stand-up comedy career jokes from 1995. There'd be a niche. People who want to hear jokes about things that were introduced in specifically pick that one year, okay? That would be my YouTube channel, Trapped in 1995. Okay, just stand-up comedy about what was going on in 1995. Okay, it's gonna be niche. Probably a few thousand people would love that. Oh wow, I love this channel. Reminds me of really specific historical events from the 90s I'd forgotten about, Okay. I'm talking myself into this now. My point is this. It would have been so meaningful if this person in a wheelchair had done their whole set and never even mentioned it. But guess what? The beautiful blonde woman who obviously works out at the gym 5 days a week and does yoga and has nice breasts. Imagine if she did her whole set without mentioning that she's a good-looking blonde woman who does yoga and has nice breasts. There were several really muscular guys we saw, whether they work out at the gym 5 days a week or 7 days or what, or they're on steroids or what. I think we saw a few different guys on steroids, to be honest with you. whatever. This muscular guy. Imagine if his whole set wasn't about being a muscular guy, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of it's about their own physical appearance, their own ethnicity, their own autobiography in this way. And, the culture of therapy, the culture created by Sigmund Freud, ultimately, culture of psychotherapy, therapy, etc. I know that these people think they're mining down to something deeper with this kind of comedy, this kind of autobiographical comedy, looking within, the same way they think that when they're talking to a therapist, they're mining down to something deeper, but they're wrong. All right. It's a completely false paradigm, right? It's as shallow as a striptease. That's what it is a psychological striptease. And as I've said about myself for years and recently, what I do isn't a striptease. It's nude. I start naked, I end naked. There's none of this bullshit. Whoever I am, it's there up front on page one. And now we're going to do something creative, departing from that. Okay. And then the other half of the equation, as I say, that's so bizarre to me is the extent to which a technique is a trap, and the whole field. I mean, imagine you had a friend who had spent years mastering jazz clarinet. I'm tempted to say jazz flute. Actually, it doesn't matter. Any of these, and you say to him, "Look, it doesn't matter how good you are at playing jazz with this instrument. You can never succeed." The year is 2023. So, like, the whole category of jazz music has collapsed and it's continuing to collapse, right? It's not that zero people on earth are interested in new jazz music. It's a small audience getting smaller. Specifically, jazz clarinet, jazz flute. When was the last time you turned on the radio? And then, when was the last time you saw a listing for a live performance of jazz clarinet, jazz flute, and you said, "Oh, great," and you called up and they said, "I'm sorry, the stadium is sold out. Every seat is full because so many people want to hear jazz flute or jazz clarinet"? Never. Like, I know you, my friend, have put years of your life into mastering this technique, but a technique is a trap, and you've got to do something new and different. I'll just mention at the opposite extreme of that, I was kind of lucky to meet these particular people. I met a few musicians who had learned to play like more than 50 instruments. And these were people who overlapped. They weren't just musicians. They were also anthropologists or ethnomusicologists, so they went out to different tribal groups. And I remember one I talked to at length. This is a female musician. But she said to me, it's totally understandable. She said, "Well, like once you've learned like 20 of this type of instrument, you can really rapidly learn. Like, in this culture, they have a different instrument, but it's similar to a flute or it's similar to anyway." But she'd spent her whole life learning new instruments up to a certain level of mastery across cultures, and like going to Africa, go to some tribe and learn how they play music and things instead of mastering one. And I think she had a successful career, because you can imagine there were enough people who were interested in that. All right. Okay. This is an extreme contrast. All right. Okay. What blows my mind about comedy in real life, on YouTube, in filmmaking, in movies, stand-up comedy, what I can see on the internet and whatever, is that you're looking at people, and it's not that they're in a position of saying, "But I've put so many years of my life into mastering the flute or mastering specifically jazz and the flute. How can I quit? How can I give this up? This is my identity. This is who I am. I can't try a new instrument. I can't try a new genre of music. I have to stick with this." Because they've never even mastered the technique. For them, the technique has become a trap, I think, in brief, just because of the positive feedback they get, just because of the ego trip of being on stage. Perhaps it's even worse for handsome men. Perhaps it's even worse for beautiful women. But we saw some real homely dudes. We saw some guys, very unattractive, very out of shape guys wearing really brightly colored sneakers. I've got a lot of these male stand-up comics. They dress like crap, and then they wear really expensive, brightly colored Nike shoes, this kind of thing, running shoes. I don't know where they get that from. But even those guys, right, These guys have no charisma and no talent as stand-up comedians. No offense, it's the truth. Probably for them, even if it's just one woman a month that flirts with them, or one woman a month that's interested in sleeping with them, right? When they're on the road doing comedy, right? That's infinitely more than the amount of attention from women they would be getting if they weren't doing it. So yeah, um, okay. Just come back to close a loophole that I opened earlier up. Why don't I just go back to making 3-hour lectures about Aristotle? there are a few people. There are a few people in the audience who are like, "Yeah, damn it, that's what I want to know." Why can't we go back to long form book reviews and discussions of political philosophy? All right, for me too, a technique is a trap, and I got too good at it. It got too easy for me, and frankly, just like playing jazz flute too, you have to realize, even though I'm very good at that, right? You're doing that for a very small audience. And I have no reason to think the audience would ever grow. Um, I think there is a question of whether or not it's good for the audience. I don't know if you're a fan of a particular musician, or for them to just create the same music again, the same comedian, for them to keep making derivative works, but it's not good for me. All right. So real briefly, we just recorded a duet. It got banned from YouTube. I assume it'll be uploaded about a week from now when I'm not banned anymore. All right. Just want to say, I start with a blank sheet of paper. I have no education in music. I know nothing about how to record a song or write a song. And super briefly, I had the concept for this song. I wrote lyrics for this song. I had a certain beat for the song. And I had these clips from YouTube videos from other people I'm criticizing, satirizing in this comedy. It's a comedic song, right? And I reach a point where I think, you know what? The pieces don't fit together. I'm going to take these YouTube clips. I'm going to get a totally new beat. I'm going to do a totally different song. I write totally new lyrics, and I call in Melissa to sing this to me as a duet. But this is significant. Even when she sat down to do this to me, when I was first explaining to her the concept of the song and the lyrics we're going to record, I said to her, look, and if this doesn't work, I'll try something totally different. I'll do something like, if we start recording this, it's not working out, I'm willing to wipe the chalkboard clean and do something new and different. All right. It can't be every 10 years that you do that. As an intellectual, as a creative person, as someone engaged in cultural production, it should be every day. You should be willing to re-examine what you're doing and pull it apart and try something new and different all the time, every day. And, why was the TV show The Simpsons successful for as long as it was? In past tense, because obviously the show has been terrible for many years. Is it because they did the same thing every week, right? That they had a formula? Or is it because they did something different every week? Because they were in a state of rebellion against the formula. There's a kind of dissent going on. The Simpsons was founded not as a sitcom, but as a satire of TV sitcoms that at that time dominated comedy. All right. As a creative person, as an intellectual, whether what you're doing is comedy or drama, you don't get ahead by worshiping at the temple of your own past successes, right? You get ahead by sinning against your own religion. And it's very strange for me to see that today, comedy, the more I look into it, it's dominated by people who, in this sense, are prisoners of a technique that they haven't had any success with, that they have not even mastered.